Hey gang, welcome back to Voltie's Classroom. Today we're going to be going over the blue sideboard cards that you should own for any realistic 7-point Highlander collection that you might be building. Now, this is a continuation of a series called Building a Better Sideboard. There's going to be a link to the original video down below, as well as a link to this list of sideboard cards, which does have a link to the video as well. Now, this is by no means comprehensive. There are plenty of blue cards that you might be playing in your main deck that might end up in a sideboard depending on the nature of your deck. There's also quite a number of blue cards that exist that are very similar to some of the cards on this list, and you know, I've listed the main one or the best version. However, if your deck really needs to have multiple copies of that effect, I might be mentioning some other cards in passing. But otherwise, let's get right into it. To start things off, we have Pact of Negation. Now, this is a free counter spell, and whether or not you put this in your sideboard depends on a number of factors. If you're playing a combo deck that really needs to be able to interact on the stack, but you don't have access to blue mana or enough blue cards, then Pact of Negation is possibly the card that you're looking for. A lot of the decks that would be playing Pact of Negation will have them in the main deck. However, there are certain metagames where you expect not to need Pact of Negation in the main deck. Maybe you're playing a Veil of Summer, or maybe you fully expect that some of your spells will be countered, but that you only really need to be forcing one through. In that case, you might put Pact in your sideboard. This is not a fair card. You should not be putting this into your deck with the idea of punking your opponent out by tapping out for a threat, and then pacting and then paying the full retail the next turn. However, obviously that is a use case that will occur some of the time, but you shouldn't be accounting for that when choosing that sideboard slot. Next up, we have Blue Elemental Blast. I'm going to lump this, Hydro Blast, and Flash Flood together, which you can see down here as well. Basically, 90% of blue decks should be playing a Blue Elemental Blast and a Hydro Blast in their sideboard. There are plenty of decks that don't need to rely on these. However, in terms of the rate that you're getting to be able to answer anything from a Fury to a Blood Moon to a Ragavan is just unmatched. So if you're building a sideboard, if you're playing a blue deck that isn't a dedicated combo deck, and even some of the combo decks will be playing these, you should be playing 2 copies of these cards. Flash Flood is the other version. It only destroys a red permanent or bounces a mountain, so it's red hate that isn't able to interact on the stack. If your deck, for some reason, really can't beat Blood Moon, and there's no way you can get around that, you might sometimes put a Flash Flood in your sideboard on top of the other blue blasts. However, these are the go-tos. Next up, we have Chain of Vapor. This is a personal favorite card of mine. Blue, instant, bounce a non-land permanent, and then if they decide to sacrifice a land, they can bounce one of your permanents, and if they do, you can then sack a land to bounce one of their permanents. In terms of bouncing anything, you don't get a rate better than Chain of Vapor. It's as simple as that. All of the other effects that can bounce a non-land permanent will cost 2 mana. Chain of Vapor has a downside, which is why it costs 1. If you're playing an all-in combo deck that needs to get through certain problem permanents, whether they're Rest in Peace, or Leyline of the Void, or Thalia, Chain of Vapor is going to be able to deal with all of those problems for you. Now, in saying that, if your combo deck requires you to have some amount of permanents in play that interact with your combo, or how you're setting up, for example, it does have a real downside. However, if you're playing something like Storm or Thoracle, where realistically you just need to have a critical mass of lands in play before going off, then Chain of Vapor is going to work. Next up, we have Consign to Memory. This is an upgraded version of Ceremonious Rejection, which is blue counter-target colorless spell. Consign to Memory is a very particular card, and you should only be playing it in certain expected metagames. It does not counter an artifact spell, which means if your opponent plays an artifact spell that you need to counter and that artifact is colored, this will not work. The most obvious example of this is Birthing Pod, however there are other artifacts that people might be playing. However, if your game, or if your plan is to counter the One Ring and have the ability to counter some triggered abilities that might matter, then this card is quite potent. Notably, it has Replicate, which means you can put extra copies on the stack to avoid counter magic. So if you're in blue and you need to interact with Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation, you can counter the Thassa's Oracle trigger multiple times, forcing your opponent to have a much wider range of interaction in order to get through. Next up we have Extract. Extract is a very particular card that people overplay in my opinion, but for blue and sorcery, you can search target player's library for a card and remove it from the game, and then they shuffle. Extract is a very cheap version of other effects of this nature, like Necromentia and Slaughter Games. However, there are a number of downsides that occur with Extract. For one, it does not hit your opponent's hand. So if your opponent is relying on one card to win the game, and they have it in their hand already, Extract will not get rid of it. Most of the time, your opponent is going to be playing multiple cards as part of their combo, and you might be able to get one half that isn't the half you were looking to get, but it does help slow them down in order to buy you extra time, in which case Extract is fine. If you're playing a deck that is good against combo decks, Extract may not be what you need for that particular sideboard. It's card disadvantage, and it really only works against some combo decks. Obviously, if you take Breach, for example, you can hurt that deck quite hard. However, if your opponent's playing Storm and you take Past in Flames, they can easily Burning Wish or Wish for something and kill you that way. So keep that in mind when looking at Extract. However, it's quite cheap, it's very versatile, and it can be put into a lot of sideboards, so it's something to think about. Next up is Flusterstorm. I'm going to link this with a couple of other spells that are your basic cheap counter magic. We have Flusterstorm, Spell Pierce, Stern Scolding, and Stubborn Denial at 1 mana. All of these cards are effectively cheap counter magic that will matter in different situations, and which one of them you play is really up to you as well as your expected metagame. Flusterstorm is the best of the bunch if you are trying to protect your own combo piece from counter magic. That is the purpose of Flusterstorm. You should not be using it to try to counter your opponent's one instant or sorcery, like a Swords to Plowshares or a Night's Whisper. You should be using this in conjunction with a powerful play as a way to protect your spells from counter magic, because you can put multiple Flusterstorms on the stack, target different counter spells, and force your opponent to either have a lot of mana or more interaction. Spell Pierce is the generic counter spell that people put in their sideboards. I think it's a very reasonable card to put in basically any sideboard as well as main decks. It counters any non-creature spell, and Spell Pierce doesn't really have a fixed purpose, and that's why it's so good. It counters anything from a turn 1 Mana Crypt to a turn 4 Jace the Mind Sculptor to a Tainted Pact. It really does it all. It doesn't ask much of you. Realistically, if you're building a sideboard and you're building a main deck and you don't have a Spell Pierce anywhere, you should maybe reconsider finding space for it. Stern Scolding is a sidestep in terms of sideboard counter magic. It specifically counters creatures, but it does have a restriction of power or toughness 2 or less. While this may seem very restrictive and unlikely to hit everything that you want, it does hit quite a lot of cards that you certainly wouldn't expect for a 1 mana counter spell. Now, there are the obvious offenders like Ragavan and Deathrat Shaman, which are incredibly powerful 1 mana creatures, but it also counters lots of 2-drops and 3-drops, as well as most of the free elementals. So for example, it counters Stoneforge Mystic, it counters Dark Confidant, it counters Lurrus, and it counters Lutri, both of which are a very big deal. It also counters things like Grief and Solitude. And so If you're not playing a Stone Scolding and you're playing a fair game plan, you should maybe try to find space for it in your sideboard. It's not the most versatile card, however it is very cheap and very good at what it does. The last of the cheap counter spells is Stubborn Denial. This is basically Spell Pierce, however if you have a large creature, it always counters the spell. Stubborn Denial is very powerful if you have a lot of ways to get 4 power for very cheap. So if you're playing Delve creatures like Gurmag Angler or Tasigur, if you're playing Death Shadow for example, if you're playing Tarmogoyfs, Stubborn Denial is probably going to do the job more often than not. And its downside is that rather than paying 2 for Spell Pierce, your opponent only has to play 1. However, if they're tapping out for a big spell, this is still going to work, and so the card is quite powerful in that regard. Next up we have Into the Floodmoor. This is a new printing from Bloomburrow, and it's blue, return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. If the gift was promised, instead return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. This is basically Chain of Vapor with extra steps. Rather than them being able to bounce one of your permanents, you can give them a tapped 1/1 in order to bounce anything, with the upside of it just being an unsummon. A notable distinction of Into the Floodmoor versus something like Chain of Vapor is that Into the Floodmoor can only bounce your opponent's permanents, so if you need your bounce spell to bounce one of your own things, for Storm Count for example, this isn't going to do that. If that's a situation that you expect to encounter, maybe you should play Chain of Vapor over Into the Floodmoor, but if the goal of the card is just, I need to get rid of a thing, I don't care what the cost is, then Into the Floodmoor is perfectly fine. Next up we have Steel Sabotage. This is very akin to Consign to Memory and Ceremonious Rejection, however it does have notable distinctions. It always counters artifact spells, so it can counter Birthing Pod and a number of other coloured artifacts, like Phyrexian Metamorph. However, it cannot counter colourless spells that are not artifacts. There aren't that many colourless spells that people are playing, however there also aren't that many coloured artifacts that people are playing. So the main reason you would use Steel Sabotage over Consign to Memory is the second line of text, which says that it can also bounce an artifact. So if you've missed your window to counter an artifact because you're on the draw and you haven't been able to deploy a land yet, Steel Sabotage can reset that artifact, which might buy you enough time to catch it on the way back down. Stifle is the last 1-mana blue sideboard card we're going to talk about today. Most of the time people play Stifle, it's in the main deck, and that's because at the very least it can catch a fetch land and act as a sinkhole. Whether or not you play Stifle versus something like Consign depends on whether or not you expect your opponent to activate an ability that you care about. So there are plenty of triggered abilities that matter, and both cards catch that, so Thassa's Oracle is the most notable one. But there are there are activated abilities that do matter. So if you need that, or if you really want to have access to a bit of mana denial, then maybe you should be playing Stifle in your sideboard. Next up we have 2 drops. We have Aethergust as the first one. So for 2 mana, you can choose a spell or permanent that's red or green, and the opponent will get to choose to put it on the top or bottom. This is a very particular card that you should not be playing very often. However, it does have enough text as a hate card against red and green. There are ways that you can make red and green permanents uncounterable. The most notable one is Cavern of Souls, and Aethergust is very particular in that it can go around uncounterable as text on a card. So if your opponent plays a Cavern of Souls naming Human and a Caves of Chaos Adventurer, Aethergust will buy you a turn to hopefully be able to deal with it better the next time it's cast. We have Dress Down next. This is a generic catch-all. For 2 mana, you get an enchantment that cantrips, and it turns off all creature abilities for 1 turn. The most obvious use case for Dress Down is to kill Urza Saga tokens. If you expect your opponent to make the full Urza Saga tokens, or even more by buying it back, Dress Down will get rid of all of them for you. There are a number of other things you can catch off guard, and it has the upside of being able to be used on your own creatures if that comes up. Dress Down works with Death Shadow, for example, and gives you a full 13/13. In conjunction with a team of Battle Rage, you can really kill people out of nowhere. You can also use it with things like Solitude and Null Drifter in order to keep the creature even though you paid the evoke cost, but otherwise it's generically flexible, it's generically powerful. Owning a Dress Down is just a good idea. Next we have Hurkyl's Recall. This is an old-timey card that not that many people have heard of if they haven't played a lot of Vintage. For 2 mana, it bounces all artifacts target player owns to their hand. Unlike Consign and Steel Sabotage, it catches everything, however it does cost more. There are also plenty of decks that want to play a Hurkyl's Recall because they want to bounce their opponent's hate artifacts like Damping Sphere or Trinisphere, but they also want the flexibility to be able to target themselves and reset things like Mox Opal or Mana Vault. It's a very flexible card in terms of the actual use case, but otherwise some decks just aren't going to have space for Hurkyl's, and that's pretty reasonable as well. Next up we have Narset's Reversal. This is a relatively new printing, and basically you can copy an instant or sorcery on the stack and then bounce the target. The most common use case for this will be bouncing something like Treasure Cruise or Ancestral Recall and getting your own copy of the card. However, in a pinch, this does usually work as a counter spell. You can play a spell, your opponent counters it, you copy the counter spell, you target the Narset's Reversal with the copy, and the counter spell goes away. This doesn't work obviously against things like Force of Will and Subtlety. Sorry, not Subtlety, Force of Negation. However, it can help you force through a spell. The last use case is if you play a spell, you can also Narset's Reversal it, put it back in your hand, and get an extra copy. The main use for this will be spells that have Storm, because you can trigger the Storm, put your copies on the stack, and then bounce the original back to your hand so that you can recast it on the same turn and get an extra set of Storm triggers should you need it. Next up we have Search Res Cantor. This is a generic value sideboard card. I will be honest, I'm a fan of this card and it is a pet card of mine. You should not be putting it into your deck without a specific goal in mind. However, if you're playing a slow blue dirtly deck and you expect your metagame to have other slow blue dirtly decks, Search Res Cantor is really powerful. Most of the time it's going to be 2 mana for a blue Rampant Growth, and at some random point in the game you're going to be able to activate it to draw a card essentially, and if you ever activate it more than once, you've usually started to bury your opponent in card advantage, which really comes up a lot in blue mirrors. I wouldn't be playing this card with too many creatures in your deck, however it is certainly a consideration for some blue control decks. Next up we have Thing in the Ice. This is basically an anti-green and an anti-white card. It is an incredibly powerful effect if your deck has the ability to flip it quite easily. So if you're playing a lot of free cantrips like Ataxian Probe, and if you're playing free spells like Mental Misstep, Gush, and Force of Will, then you can flip this thing either immediately or the next turn. Otherwise, spending some mana on removal spells and cantrips, and then being able to reset your opponent's board and get a 7/8 threat out of the deal is something worth considering. It's a very common sideboard card in a lot of the other constructed formats, and its use case in Highlander is basically the same. Next up, we have a bunch of 3 mana hate pieces. A lot of the 3 mana blue sideboard cards are very particular and very good at beating up on certain decks, so we'll go through them in chunks. First off, we have Back to Basics and Harbinger of the Seas. These are your 2 anti-land cards in blue. If you're in red, you can play Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. Otherwise, there are a number of other artifacts that you can play like Winter Moon and Winter Orb, but these 2 are the main ones that you're going to be playing if you're a blue X deck, and you don't have the ability to deal with your opponent's lands that well. If you're playing a combo deck, you don't need access to these, but otherwise, if you're planning on playing a fair game, and you really are worried about your opponent strip locking you or tabernacling you, then some of these will help. Next we have the anti-card draw cards, which are Hull Breacher and Narset. These two both stop your opponent from drawing extra cards and have additional text on top of that. If you're in a metagame that has wheels, for example, then these two are quite good. Otherwise, they do serve a purpose of being generically good against blue mid-range decks that play a lot of cantrips. We have Energy Flux as the next dedicated hate piece. All artifacts gain an upkeep cost of 2, so it's very similar to Kataki War's Wage. The main reason you would play Energy Flux over something like Nullrod is if you have your own artifacts that you care about, but you don't expect to have too many in play at once, or if you just want a permanent that's a bit harder to remove. Energy Flux being an enchantment does make it quite difficult. We then have a couple of other cards to fill out our 3-drop slot that are all a bit more generic. We have Brazen Burrower. It's very similar to Chain of Vapor and some of the other bounce spells that you have available. However, it does also have the upside of being able to give you a flyer. If you expect to need to bounce certain permanents like Blood Moon, and you also want to have access to a flyer for mechanics like the Initiative or the Monarchy, that would be the main reason to play Brazen Burrower over any of the other bounce spells. Next we have Chrome Host Seed Shark. There's a very long-standing tradition of blue control decks playing threats in their sideboard, especially creature threats when their opponent is siding out their creature removal. This is no surprise that this would show up. It's basically one of those effects. There are plenty of other cards you can play depending on your color spread, like Third Path Iconoclast or Young Pyromancer that act similarly, but Chrome Host Seed Shark is available if the other colors you're playing don't help you out in that regard. We then have 2 counter spells. We have Force Negation and Mystical Dispute. These have very different applications despite both being counter magic. Force Negation cannot be used to protect your own spells unless they're being cast at instant speed, and it does not help you against your opponent's instant speed combo if they're doing it in your turn. So you have to be mindful that Force Negation is not just a free counterspell. It does have very real downsides. However, if you expect that you can gain enough card advantage using the One Ring, for example, that you can use Force Negation proactively to deal with your opponent's Planeswalkers, for example, or their other power plays, then that would be the reason to play Force in your sideboard. Mystical Dispute, however, is very, very good in Counter Wars, and that's about it. There are plenty of blue non-creature spells that you can be using Mystical Dispute on. Most of them are counter spells. You can also hit things like Time Walk and Ancestral Recall. Mystical Dispute has the upside of being able to hit blue creature and permanent spells. Most notably, you can hit Murktide Regent or Psychic Frog, for example, with the downside being that this only hits blue spells. Realistically, you should not be paying 3 mana to mana leak anything, and if you're doing that, you probably shouldn't have bought it in Mystical Dispute, or you've run into a very strange situation, in which case the fail case is quite reasonable. We have a Tishana's Tidebinder here. This is a relatively new printing as well. It's basically Stifle on a stick, but it does help against permanents that activate their abilities multiple times over the course of the game. Tishana's Tidebinder can be used to counter something like a Skull Clamp Equip, or a Birthing Pod activation, or a One Ring activation. It's a very powerful card. However, you do need to keep in mind that it doesn't always do what you need it to do. It does always stifle, but it doesn't always turn off the permanent. If your opponent for some reason is using an enchantment or a land that has an activated ability that you need to turn off forever, Tishana's Tidebinder is not going to do that for you. Next up we have Vendilion Click. This is a very old card. It hasn't been playable for a while. However, it is quite cheap at the moment, and owning one is kind of reasonable if you want to have a really well-rounded sideboard that you can build from. Vendilion Click is very good against some combo decks because it also applies pressure, which is usually what you need to do when dealing with a combo deck. On the surface, being able to effectively Thoughtseize your opponent should be able to warrant this card being just good. However, the fact that you get the rest of the information about their hand is a big deal. The fact that it has flash and can be cast in your opponent's draw step or in response to another spell to take a sorcery matters as well. And having a 3-mana 3/1 flying body does come up if your opponent dukes you with a sideboard threat. But otherwise, Vendilion Click is a very well-rounded package. It really, realistically, shouldn't be showing up in too many sideboards in 2024, but it is still, on its own basis, quite a powerful card. Next up, we have Wipe Away. This card is very similar to all of the other bounce spells, but it has two notable differences. One, it has Split Second, which means if you need to bounce something and you need the bounce spell to resolve, Wipe Away will work. Part 2 is it costs 3 mana. 3 mana is a very different amount to 1 or 2, and you really need to be able to go off, bounce your opponent's permanent in their end step, and then blow them up immediately. Otherwise, Wipe Away is kind of fine. It does technically bounce lands as well. It doesn't have a non-land restriction on it. You shouldn't be using this to Stone Rain your opponent, and realistically, if you're playing a creature deck, wiping away something like Glacial Chasm or Tabernacle shouldn't be coming up. So realistically, the reason that you would play Wipe Away is that you're okay with it being 3 mana, and you really need it to be uncounterable. Next up we have the 4, 5, and 7 drops. However, all of these cards are designed to be cast for 0 mana, and we'll go through them and their use cases now. Mindbreak Trap is very good against critical mass-based combo decks, and that is it. It does not work against 2-card combo decks like Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and it does not work against things like Reanimator. The main reason you would play Mindbreak Trap is not if you're playing blue cards, but if you're specifically not playing blue and you need to be able to deal with something like Storm. Death and Taxes has historically played Mindbreak Trap in its sideboard in Legacy, and that is its use case here. However, for the sake of completion, I've listed it in the blue category, despite it not really being a blue card. Subtlety is a free pitch spell like Force of Will, Force of Negation, for example, but notably it only hits creatures and planeswalkers. If you're playing a blue control deck and you're light on threats and you need to stop the initiative for just a turn so that you can do something more impactful with your mana, that is why you would play Subtlety. The fact that it's a 4-mana 3/3 flyer should not be coming up very often, however it is a free roll. But realistically, the main purpose of this is I need an extra free answer to White Plume Adventurer, and I have enough blue cards to pitch. Misdirection is a very niche card that's quite old as well. Realistically, you should not be playing this with the intent of using it to win Counter Wars. That's just the fail case. Play Misdirection if your metagame has a lot of Ancestral Recalls, or Time Warps, not Time Walk. Any big impactful spells that target the owner that you can redirect to yourself for an effect. Realistically, its main use case is for Ancestral Recall. However, it does have a number of backup cases like Counter Magic, stopping burn spells that might kill you, for example, protecting your creatures from Swords to Plowshares by targeting your opponent's creatures. It's a flexible card, but you shouldn't be putting in your sideboard unless you have something very specific in mind that you want to get out of Misdirection. Submerge, on the other hand, is very flexible. The requirement that your opponent controls a forest is realistically the only part of this card that you need to keep in mind when putting it in your sideboard. It isn't going to work against a Mardu deck. It isn't going to work against a Grixis deck. However, if your opponent is playing creatures and they're playing forests, Submerge is going to be a removal spell most of the time. For anyone who isn't aware, when you cast Submerge, it puts the creature on the top of its owner's library. So on the one hand, if you're putting a Tarmogoyf on top of their library so it doesn't kill you, and then they play the Tarmogoyf again, that's pretty bad. The timing of Submerge that you should be using is when your opponent shuffles their library. If your opponent cracks a fetch and you submerge their creature in response, it will go on top, the fetch will resolve, and the library will be shuffled, and that's how you get your removal spell out of Submerge. There's plenty of other use cases for the card in terms of actual gameplay and how you cast it, but that's the main purpose. I'm going to get rid of a creature, and I'm going to get rid of it good. Lastly, we have Commandeer. This is a pet card as well, however it has shown up in both Modern and Legacy before. If your opponent is playing a really big non-creature spell, you might want to Commandeer it. The most obvious example is the One Ring, however there are other large planeswalkers that people might be playing. If you're in a metagame that's flooded with Minsc and Boo, for example, you can maybe use Commandeer for that. However, the cost of 2 blue cards really does require your deck to have Commandeer in mind. You need to not only have enough blue cards, but also enough ways to offset that card disadvantage. If you're playing your own One Ring, that's going to be the easiest way to do it. Otherwise, you can play Treasure Cruise, for example, or Lutri plus Gush. Overall, those are the main blue cards that I think you should own if you want to have a well-rounded sideboard library for Highlander. As I said earlier, there are plenty of other cards that could be on this list if you want multiple copies of an effect. There's also plenty of blue cards that you should own that are basically always going to be showing up in your main deck. So if you're really just looking for sideboard options and you've got your main deck sorted, by all means come into this list. There'll be a link below for it and you can check it out. This video was brought to you by my sponsors and donors. I very much appreciate everything they've been doing to support the channel. If you would like to support me and the content, there'll be links below to the Patreon and the Ko-Fi, but by no means is it necessary. If you enjoy the content, please do consider subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything and it really does help the channel out a ton. But otherwise, leave a like if you like the video. All the relevant links will be below, and I'll catch you next time.